Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Figurenspiel. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case the updated version of my part 1 figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case I'll be discussing basing 6mm World War II or Cold War figures. In this video we'll be covering figure basing ideas and how to achieve different basing outcomes. Many gamers do not base their 6mm figures, and I was one of them for many years. However, I came to the realization that basing your figures was, in the end, the best strategy, especially if you're playing platoon or higher scale sets of rules. These rules require elements to have specific frontages. Coupled with this reason, there was also the issue of storage. Once you've based an element, you can store them in felt-covered boxes with spaces 3 centimeters wide. This allows you to tightly fit your figures into them. This protects your figures and allows you to transport them without the risk of them being damaged. For myself, the final trigger was I kept on forgetting what my figures were. By basing them, I could identify the figure by placing a label on the bottom of the base. Even for those players who do not base their figures, they still have to base infantry and artillery, so this is something they still need to deal with. What you see here is my older, and I mean older, very older basing system, which I was not very happy with. The base is cardboard, and as a result it had the tendency of warping. The flock is too coarse and simply does not look attractive when you look at it close up. When I created this flocking system, my original objective was to use a flock similar to the flock on my terrain. And I must admit, when you look at the whole playing area with bases on them, it does look reasonably acceptable. Unfortunately, when you look close up, especially for infantry, it doesn't look very realistic and it doesn't look very good. I started flocking Cold War forces, which is where I initially started with this system. And Cold War had very little infantry, so I didn't really notice the problem. But once I started playing World War II games, the flaws became very obvious, as well as not giving me very good close-up photos for my videos. After a lot of experimentation and rebasing over many years, I now use MDF bases with a two-tone, high-quality woodland fine turf covering. I also changed my terrain system to use the same woodland system, and the effect is very good. As a general rule, I'm reasonably happy with my current system, but you never know. I may decide to enhance it in the future, and I may be forced to yet again rebase all my figures, something I have vowed many times to never do, but I keep on doing it regardless. I decided to download a number of photos from the internet to determine what other gamers were doing. In this example, infantry are being mixed with Soviet armour. The best thing about these bases is the use of grass patches. These are typical resin bases, which I will not be adopting. While I am not a fan of resin bases, these bases match the playing area terrain reasonably well, which is an important consideration when making your bases. These are more photos of the brown resin bases with patches of grass. I'm uncertain what the bases are made of, but I suspect it's resin which is rather thick, probably more than 2mm. The best thing about resin is that it allows you to merge your infantry into the base, thus avoiding having their bases being visible. This looks good, but my playing area terrain is mainly green, so brown bases would not match it. This brings up an important point. The bases need to match your playing area terrain. Before deciding what base effect you wish, you need to confirm what type of playing area you'll be mainly playing on. In this case, the bases match the playing area, which you can see in the photos, so is not an issue. These bases also use grass patches, but the base seems to be a brown flock with the edges of the bases being green. This would match a green playing area and would match my playing area terrain. Again, I was struck of how effective a two-tone effect was. I feel this is a critical element of having a good base scheme. I do like these bases. This shows a range of bases. Two are similar to what we've already seen, but the bottom right is interesting. Part of one base displays the vehicle type, which is something I always wanted to avoid, which is writing on the bases. While I understand why players do this, I feel it does not look very good. I feel the vehicle type can be placed on the bottom of the base or on the edge, something which I will show later in the video. On the left is an excellent base of infantry with a mortar. not only do we see the two-tone effects, but some additional figures or features, which in this case are boxes of ammo. The two top images are standard green two-tone bases with infantry, although on the right the brown edges are not ideal. Obviously this base was painted brown and then clumps of grass added to it. I think retaining green edges, like the figure on the left, is better, but both are very nice bases. The lower two bases look like very large bases with 6mm figures on them. These are almost a diorama and they look very nice indeed. I am uncertain if I would go to this effort, but I would certainly move partially in this direction. More examples of two-tone bases at the top. Brown bases with green grass. The bottom are single tone, but with an interesting contrast effect on the base. My preference is the base at the top left. It looks very good indeed. But the one on the top right is also pretty good again. I'm not so keen about the single tone bases, although I must admit the contrast does look good at the bottom. This shows a multi-tone desert base which is incredibly detailed. The terrain looks like resin, but the actual bases look like very thin MDF. They could even be metal. Many gamers base figures on thin metal which can stick to a magnet. They use this for storage purposes, and that system is actually very good. I don't like metal bases because the flock comes off too easily. This shows more desert-themed bases, in this case with some grass included and infantry wandering around the vehicles. I'm uncertain if I would mix infantry with vehicles in a normal situation, unless it's headquarters. And as headquarters, these do actually look very good. This base is very interesting and achieves the diorama status. I have no idea how the yellow-brown effect is done, but it does look very nice. The base is very thick. I suspect it's 3mm MDF, and this is actually a direction that I've moved to lately. This shows more two-tone bases, and once again, I do not know how the rocky effect is done. These do look good. As a warning to the viewers, I am not going to this level of detail, so if you wish to copy this effect, you need to work out how it's done yourself. I think these are very large bases, perhaps 5 centimeters wide. It's also possible these are 3mm figures on standard 3 centimeter wide bases, but let's go with the large base using 6mm for the moment. Once again, a nice diorama, and it shows what you can do if you want to use 15mm scale bases for your 6mm figures, assuming that's correct. The grass effect is very nice indeed, and I have made a big effort to try and duplicate this as much as possible in my current bases. These bases are moving towards what I'm thinking of at the present moment. The green looks like a type of flock which is run over some type of rocky material. The base in the centre left with the green edges would suit my playing area, and I think is actually quite good. Now, this may not be World War II, but it certainly looks good. Once again, a green tufts of grass. In this section, I'm stealing some instructions from another video. The link to the video is in the title here, and I'll also try and make sure that the URL is in the description of this video. Now let's go to the instructions. Here we have an MDF base, which could be 2mm or 3mm, I'm uncertain. I used to use 2mm cardboard, then moved to 2mm MDF, and now use 3mm MDF. The base here is painted with a black-grey colour. It's not a pure black and is more a slate grey or very dark grey. I personally use a NATO green, but the key point is the base colour will influence the final element that you present, so select the colour wisely. If using cardboard, you should use coloured sheets of paper glued to the cardboard rather than spraying paint. I used to paint cardboard bases, but I found painting cardboard can sometimes warp it. This is not an issue with MDF, which is why I use paint, or actually these days spray paint. Once the base paint is dry, I then apply the first flock layer, in this case using Woodlands Dirt, which is a dark brown fine flock. Now, personally, for me, I normally place the highlight flock on first, a blob in the centre of the base, either very light or very dark, then tap the base so it spreads, and then cover this with the primary flock colour. The glue that is used, or at least I use, is a hobby glue, which dries slowly and is not as thick as let's say wood glue or high cost wood glue, Make sure the glue is fully dry before going to the next step. Parts of the base that's already covered with the dirt, woodlands, turf is dabbed with a watered down craft glue, and then a middle green fine flock is added to give you a two-tone effect. This is a darker green than I would normally use, but does look good. Make sure the glue is fully dry before going to the next step. In this case, you do get a two-tone effect which is more 3D than if you placed the highlight flock first and then covered the standard or default flock on top of it. It's entirely up to the individual gamer which kind of effect you want. The next step here is to cover or place some multicoloured rocks on the base. The rocks which are used are railway ballast, and you will need to find several different colours of railway ballast to give you the multicolour effect. In this video, superglue is used to glue the ballast, but I suspect this could also be done with PVA glue. Spread out the rocks and the final effect is very good. I'd keep the rocks away from the centre as much as possible, otherwise your vehicle will not sit well on the base. I personally would miss this step, but in this case some wood shavings are added. This was created by blending in a blender dried leaves. Watered down craft glue is used here. The final layer is clumpy green flock using glue down with craft glue. Only a few spots are done and the result gives you some depth, which is a very good look indeed. I normally use a very light green brush flock, and before I do this I spray the base with a watered down solution of PVA to ensure the base flock does not flake off. The final step is to place the figure on the base. You need to first press the model on the base to make sure it sits flat on the base. Craft glue is used in this case, but I would possibly consider using a hardware PVA wood glue as it's much stronger, or even super glue. The trouble with super glue, of course, is because you're placing it on a very uneven surface, it probably won't glue correctly. So use whatever method works best for you. This does look very good. I originally felt this was too dark, but I've now changed my mind. Dark bases, well done, provide the best result. After viewing the video, I used that system for my flocking, but I have altered the system quite a bit over the last couple of years. I now cover the bases with glue and then place a blob of highlight flock onto it, either very light or very dark. In this case, you can see very light highlight flock. I then tap the base to spread it and then cover it with the base flock, which in my case will either be earth blend or green blend. I do not press the base into the flock anymore, which, and I have to admit, pressing it into the flock does work, but I found this was not required. The only trick that you need to really watch out for is that the colour of the base must match the flock. I normally spray my bases with NATO green, and it works well for me. You will notice my bases, while darker than my original bases, are lighter than the example video that you just saw. While I've changed the system that I use many times, there are some basic rules which always seem to apply. The bases must match the playing area. You need at least a two-tone effect. 3 is possible, but may end up being a bit too busy. The pattern that you use must not be too busy. In this example that you see here, the brown patches are simply too busy. I now only have one large blob in the centre of the element, and it looks much better. Placing bushes on the base really enhances the base. I use woodland brush, and there are a lot of other things that you can do as well. If you wish, you can really go overboard, but as I have so many figures, I prefer a simple system which gives me the effect I want without too much effort. When you go onto YouTube or other instructions for how to base figures, most instructions suggest starting with a dark colour on the base and layering lighter flock colours over it. I originally went the other way, but in the end I agreed with this general suggestion. Players can choose whichever system they feel gives them the best result. Experimentation is pretty important. My initial objection to MDF was its thickness. However, I have found 2mm MDF bases, which are available from the UK, ended up being too thin, so now I've changed my mind entirely. After much experimentation, I discovered that thin bases were a lot harder to pick up, especially infantry. For World War II, I use a lot of infantry, and after a while I came to the conclusion that 3mm thick MDF bases were the best fit solution for 6mm figures, so you can actually pick them up and move them around easier. The company which supplies me with my MDF bases is a company called War Bases, which has a very wide range of bases and movement trays. Almost all bases I use now are 3x3cm or 3x4cm for 6mm. That includes ancients and Napoleonics, incidentally. The movement trays are also very good, and I use these for my 15mm Napoleonics and ancients. Incidentally, for my 15mm figures, I generally always use 2mm thick bases. I do prefer thinner bases. With 15mm, you can pick up the base from the figure, so it's not an issue for picking up. Unfortunately, for 6mm, particularly infantry, it becomes a major issue. So 3mm is what I have to use for 6mm. At least that's my conclusion. Today, I exclusively use MDF bases, but for players on a budget, cardboard is still a viable option. This shows some of my older cardboard-based figures. In the old days, all my figures were based on cardboard. Now, in this case, the flocking is awful, but using Woodland's fine turf, you can achieve the same effect that you saw earlier with cardboard. I use 1.75mm or 2mm cardboard. This can be purchased in large size sheets from a craft shop. The 2mm cardboard is superior but is much harder to cut. As a result, 1.75mm cardboard is what I generally use, and I can cut quite easily with my Scorpion dressmaking scissors, which is a brute of a pair of scissors. I use exterior PVA Woodland glue because it dries quickly and is very thick, so there is minimal moisture absorption. This shows the first stage of glue application. Make sure the glue covers every part of the cardboard. The last thing you need is the coloured sheets rising on your base. An alternative is to paint the bases. This works well, and I normally use watered down house paint for this. I've had problems with warping, but I admit it's not serious. I mainly use cardboard to thicken my base. If I was using MDF, this would not be required. The colour I'm placing on the cardboard is going to be a light brown sheet. I also use a light green, and dark brown. It all depends on the flat flock I'm placing on top. I normally use a lighter colour and put darker flock, but of course you can also do the darker colour and put lighter flock if you so desire. This shows the light green base. The colour matches my playing area green, which is the main colour theme I needed to achieve, at least when I created this. I later discovered this was far too light, so now I use a dark green sheet of paper instead. It's critical to make sure the coloured sheet sticks fully to the cardboard. For this I use a number of heavy books, each of which is covered by plastic contact. PVA glue does not stick to clear plastic, so if the glue comes out of the edge of the base, it's not an issue. In this case I have two sheets under the book, and my brown sheet will be covered by another book. My final book I placed on top of the pile is my trusty Conway's Fighting Ships, and I use this because this is a very heavy book. The front of the cardboard sheets has these sheets stuck to them. This way the bottom of each of my bases contain a description of what the vehicle is. Because this has to be rules agnostic, only the figure description is included. When I use MDF, I have to cut each label out and glue them to the bases individually. These are the bases after all the gluing has been completed, and they are cut out into 12 base strips. This shows a strip on its side. The cardboard is 1.75mm thick with the coloured paper on one side and the printed paper on the other side. The overall thickness ends up being about 2mm, which is about the minimum thickness to allow you to pick up the bases with any degree of ease. This is one of the dangers of my system using cardboard. If the glue is not spread correctly and pressed down enough using books, it can lift. MDF would solve this. However, these are very old figures, and these days I rarely have this issue. Incidentally, these figures are homemade, which is why they are so poor quality. I use these figures for testing purposes, and I will be using them to test my new basing ideas in this video. Another example of lifting, but the figures in the centre is more typical. This is a rather boring figure and base, which is why I am looking at implementing a new basing system. The figures are homemade, so they are poor quality. Now, these are the scissors I use to cut my cardboard, and these are very dangerous scissors indeed. I have cut myself many times, and if you go down this path, I urge you to be very careful. Incidentally, these scissors are huge, but it cuts through thick cardboard like a hot knife through butter. The edges of the base needs to be coloured. You don't want ugly cardboard showing. This can be done with paint or with a whiteboard marker. While the whiteboard marker is easy to use, I'm moving back to paint as the colour consistency is superior. But for people who lack a garage and are making their bases in a flat or house, this does allow you to avoid the use of paint. If you do not like cardboard bases, but do not wish to spend too much money on laser cut bases, then you can create your own homemade MDF bases. This section covers my guide on basing using homemade 3mm MDF bases. I have another video which gives you an idea of how you can create them. I've selected some preliminary colours, which I suspect will not be satisfactory in the long term, but will show you how I've created my MDF figures or bases. The old figures on the old bases are shown at the top, and the painted MDF bases at the bottom left. These are handmade and painted with a diluted house paint. The colour I have selected matches green or brown flock. At the bottom right is my test base showing the flocked colour effect. I am first applying the light green flock. The bases are lined up and a blob of glue is placed on each. I use my finger to evenly spread it. You can water it down a bit and use a brush, but I find this less messy and has a similar effect. You'll see my art trowel in the centre. I use this to apply any glue in a controlled manner. Once again, you can water down your glue and brush it on, but I find this system as effective. You'll now see how I do this when I apply the second flock. My trusty finger has done its work again. Make sure all surfaces are fully covered and try not to make it too thick. The one benefit of the brush technique is the glue will typically not be too thick. Press each base into the flock and then tap any excess flock off the base, either the metal object or your fingers. I tend to do the latter, even though it does leave some loose flocks on the base. As I spray the base with a water-based PVA solution, the loose flock is secured at that point, and then I have to file off the stuff at the edge. All the bases are flocked, and now we leave them to dry. I normally dry overnight or 24 hours. This is to ensure that there is no residual wet glue problems when I apply the next flock layer, which is pretty important. It's 24 hours later and I'm ready to put the second flock on the bases. In this case I'm using notch green flock. Applying the glue, there are many ways of doing this. In this example, I place a blob of glue on the trowel and then apply where it's required. The other method is to place a drop of glue on the base and then use a trowel to spread around as required. The former gives you more control, the latter is quicker. This shows another flocking system. I did a lot of experimentation and changed my flocking system quite a bit. In this video, the previous example uses a flock which is designed to provide depth and is not suitable as a foundation to my base. At least I don't consider it. I found some fine flock from Notch which matches the colours I require, at least at this stage. I now feel woodland provides a superior fine turf, and that's what I generally always use. The second layer is applied. Now wait for 24 hours for the next step. Make sure everything is fully dry before you go to the next step. The bases are ready to be sprayed with a diluted solution of PVA glue. The reason why I do this is to reduce the amount of flock which comes off my figures. I find everything associated with my hobby has a layer of flock everywhere. If I cover the flock with glue, this will be minimised. Players can skip this step if this is not a problem, but I strongly advise you that you do this. This shows my bases after the spraying. My spray bottle can be seen in the top right corner, and I actually obtained that from a craft shop. Glue will get everywhere, so once you've sprayed your bases, place your bases on a plastic surface. This is an example, but the best surface should be smooth to avoid any bumps forming under the bases. Under the plastic container you will see a white sheet of paper. This is a sheet of paper on 3mm MDF board and covered with plastic contact. I placed the bases on this after this photograph was taken, and this is what I generally use to allow my bases to dry. You may choose to skip this step, but I stick a description of the figure under the base. On the right is my sheet, which contains my descriptions, which is printed on thick paper. Using hardware quality exterior PVA glue, because it's thicker, place a small amount on the base and evenly spread across the entire base. Then apply the labels. You will notice the paper curls. Place these bases bottom down on a sheet of plastic or book covered with plastic, then place a book covered with plastic on top of it. This is to press the labels down. Some trimming in this case is required, but that is because my bases are homemade and it's not exactly a 3mm square. Incidentally, pressing it down with a book also helps with the flock on top. You will have a reasonable amount of three-dimensional effect because you've got two tones. When you press the book on it, you flatten it out, which makes it easier to place the figure on it. The labels are now dry and it's time to mount the figure with any extra terrain. Just a quick note, should make sure the labels are fully dry, so I normally wait for 24 hours. The other thing you should note is that the edges are a bit rough, there's a bit of flock there. I strongly advise you use a file to smooth it down and maybe even paint the edges to make it look nice. If you have professionally manufactured MDF counters, you'll still need to file it, but you may not need to paint it. Okay, in this example, I'm placing a couple of bushes on each base. On the left shows the glue for the bushes applied using my trowel. In the center, I place the bushes on the glue. I simply use my fingers to pick up a small amount of the fibers and place it on the glue. On the right shows the figure mounted on the base. In this case, I am using PVA glue to mount the figure. If the base was flatter, I would use super glue. The main benefit of super glue is if you decide to rebase the figure, it's easy to get the figure off the base without any residue. With PVA, there will be residue, which requires some careful effort to remove. If you use water-soluble PVA, you could just let the thing soak for a week. However, I suspect that may actually have an effect on your paint job, so I would avoid it. The bases are now complete. It just now needs to dry. The white glue will disappear within 24 hours. The top left figure is a real CNC figure. The rest are test homemade figures, which I use for testing purposes only. As you can see here, the edges have not been smoothed. This is why I strongly advise that you use a file to smooth the edges to give your bases a nice look. What we see here is slightly out of focus close-up of the final base figures. The figures are homemade, which I use to try out paint, so they're not really particularly great. Today I would edge the bases with a black felt tip marker, as I feel a black edge to the base is less visible and looks a lot better. This shows another basing system on 3mm bases. These are old figures which were incorrectly painted and the bases are homemade, but this gives you an idea of what you can achieve based on personal preferences. This is a much later image and shows you the base effect with the grass added to the base. I think this has a reasonably good effect as it gives you a nice three-dimensional effect. I also find for infantry you can actually arrange this bush in a way to make it appear the infantry is hiding behind bushes. Same thing applies with anti-tank guns, etc. It's generally, I think, a fairly good effect. It shows you the same figures, slightly out of focus. It shows how my camera also gives you a very different colour based on the lighting conditions. Incidentally, these are placed in a movement tray. The reason why I use movement trays is that some of my rules use strength points. So instead of using strength points, I use these larger movement trays, which come in 3, 6 and 9 sizes, and place my figures in them with each figure representing one strength point. That you can use that. And there are other rules like Panzer Corps, which normally have 4 elements altogether, and I place them into a 4-element base so they're always together and easier to move. I now wish to show the difference between a single tone base and a two-tone base. In this case we see a single tone base using a single flock type. It's acceptable, but the bases do not enhance the figure in any way. Single tone bases just tend to look boring. This shows some of the same figures on a two-tone base. The image does not even do justice to the base, but I found the base begins to enhance the figure on it. This is the difference between diorama and a model. I feel the bases here are too busy and I now only use a single large blob of dark earth in the centre of the element, and that tends to look better, but nonetheless even this looks a lot better than your single tone bases. There are lots of different ways of creating bases. I've only covered a few of the simple and low cost options. My later videos cover more complex and costly basing systems. And so we come to an end of my part 1 video on basing figures. I've covered a number of different suggestions you could consider in creating bases for your figures, and this certainly is not an extensive example of all the different options that you have available. For new players, I would strongly suggest picking something that's fairly simple and achievable, and be prepared to rebase as you discover something better and new. For experienced players, this video will be less of value. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.